5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, ignition, liftoff.
You're listening to Relentless. This is the show for high performers who are driven and committed to being at their best. Nick Peterson and Jonathan Montgomery, co-founders of Relentless Dietetics, are your hosts.
Welcome to the Relentless Podcast. I'm Nick Peterson, hanging out again today with Jonathan Montgomery.
What is up?
And the Dr. Trevor Kashi.
Hello!
And we are here again today to discuss how to get a little bit better every day. Last week we were talking about what we like to call brackets. Basically determining the parameters that will help you live your highest quality of life, your best life. If you haven't listened to that episode, go back and give that a listen and then dive back into this one. Right somewhere in the middle there, Dr. K, you dropped a massive knowledge bomb, a tweetable. And that is your maximum attainability is not your maximum maintainability.
Holy cow. Yes. I just kind of pulled that out of my butt a little bit and then realized that I liked it. And I've been started writing about it a little bit. But I think this is actually something that you can apply to a lot of facets in your life. I think it's particularly applicable to things like exercise and weight loss. But it's essentially like, when am I going to stop actively doing something to progress, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, but we'll get into that as the podcast progresses. It's like, when am I going to stop trying to purposefully progress and start doing something that I can maintain? And is that inherently bad? And I don't really think it's an easy question to answer, because it's not really a matter of getting down to a predetermined goal. Because kind of like when you start out with a plan and you want to progress, like where you want to be and the road you take and the progress you make, most of the time, I think your goals are probably going to change as they go. And I think it's good when people figure out, like, at a point to where they are satisfied versus what their ideal is, so you can kind of cruise that line of asymptotic returns. And I know Nick likes to go into that a little bit, but it's essentially like there's going to be a point where the energy you put in, the payout doesn't make sense anymore. Where is that point for you? Because that is a personal thing. And basically you have to figure out, like, what is sensible. So really it's kind of like this, it's really like a law of sensibility, right? If you follow the graph, progress is going to be going to a halt somewhere. And you have to decide, like Jonathan likes to say, is the juice worth the squeeze now? Can you make progress? Yes. But is that progress worth the other things you will have to take away to keep going? And that's where you can temporarily pull away from other facets of your life to continue progressing to achieve a status, right? Olympians are a perfect example, not common, obviously, but these people dedicate their lives to achieve a temporary status with that understanding that they are not going to be at that status forever. And then they can go back to where they were before and they can maintain a certain level of fitness or psychology or whatever. But the point is that there's an understanding that there are times where you can peak, and you can't have a peak unless you have a trough. And being able to grasp that from like a conceptual psychological standpoint, I think is of the utmost importance. I know that was kind of like a word vomit, but does that make sense, guys?
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. And I think when you do engage in the word vomit, there's going to be a lot of key takeaways in there. I mean, there's a couple ones that I want to touch on. One is like you said, the path to success, whatever you define that as, is rarely a straight line, and like you said, during that meandering kind of wandering walkabout journey you're on, how you define success tends to change. And so that's why I think, it's rarely ever a race to the finish, but instead it's that marathon we always talk about. And the other, crucial concept to take away from that is like what we always talk about, this overarching thing that kind of defines everything we discuss, is that better every day. And better every day doesn't mean you get to be your absolute best in all areas on all the days. That's just silly. But through those periods and times and phases, putting focused efforts in certain areas sometimes, maintaining other areas other times, you can improve across the board in a variety of areas so that you're better in all of them on any given day. And I think that's the key, is that balance between sacrificing everything in your life to reach one goal versus maintaining a high quality of life in multiple areas that kind of contribute to your whole, a more overarching goal in multiple disciplines. And I think that's the big takeaway that I get from it.
Yeah. And I'm going to drop another Dr. Kashi tweetable here. And it's from the retreat. So if you don't know, that we get together with our inner circle members and we have these high impact retreats. And it's just kind of like, hey, let's sit in a circle and talk. And it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And one of the things that came out, and it was probably just another thing that popped right out of Trevor's mouth, is nobody has a weight loss problem. And the whole room kind of looks like, yeah, we all had weight loss problems. But nobody has a weight loss problem. They have a maintenance problem. We see that with nutrition, fitness, but other areas as well. It's not that we don't know how to get from A to B. Most people can do that in a sprint. They have no idea how to stay at B or progress beyond that.
Yeah, I think this one kind of falls under that everyone knows what to do maxim, yet the reality is so few are able to do it. Everybody can push and lose weight, but then what happens when it's time to maintain those losses? Knowledge doesn't always result in clarity or action. To kind of beat that dead horse with weight loss, what do you got to do? You got to move more and eat less. You want to be wealthy? Just save your money and invest wisely. This is all easy stuff. Like we talk about, you want to get better every day? Well, just keep improving. It's super simple until it's not. Until things stop going according to plan, until life throws you a curve, or until familial obligations, children, work, or whatever starts requiring shifts in your intention. And that is, I think, where people tend to experience that eventual overwhelm and frustration that cause them to quit it all together and sets them back to square one, where they repeat that yo-yo cycle. That whole failing to plan is planning to fail thing when things don't go your way.
This is exactly why I'm like, we've taken, in the context of the philosophy of RD, it's back a lot of layers, right? So there's definitely lots of people focus on the numbers aspect, right? Calories in, calories out, move less, move more, eat less, or move less, eat more. That actually sounds much better. And you can take a step back and be like, all right, it's behavior, right? It's not that calories in, calories out matters as much as it's like, okay, if you're acting like a dingus, like maybe you should stop acting like a dingus and things take care of themselves. And then, okay, that's reasonable. But then you can take a step back further and say, all right, you can control your behavior actively, but then that's exhausting, right? You are just consistently restraining yourself 24 hours a day, and eventually you're going to pop. So what's the answer to that? All right, we remove the willpower aspect and we introduce habit-based coaching, which is another effective way to get people to go where they want to be, which is essentially, okay, we're going to take behaviors we know you need to succeed and help you program them into yourself so you don't have to spend as much mental energy to implement them. And what I want to do is peel it a step further and say you can automate behavior, but the cognition aspect to me is most important. Basically, anybody will do anything with a gun to their head. And you can get people to program behaviors in rote with really negative associations with it. I mean, to be extreme, there are, like post-traumatic stress, right? People have a trauma in their lives and then they have a physiological and behavioral response to it that's essentially programmed. So to me, what's most important is to look at the cognitive aspect of all this and essentially say, why do I want to make these changes? Because the lens that I'm looking through helps me make the decisions to determine whether or not it's worth the effort. And then I feel like when that is in place, a lot of these other factors tend to fall together in a way that makes the most sense. So if you're in basically the right frame of mind, then all of the other stuff kind of takes care of itself. And you no longer have to look up the answer in the back of the book because you understand the fundamentals to the point to where you can make informed decisions. That's another word vomit. I'm like, I'm caffeinated.
There's a couple weeks in a row on fire.
You're on a roll, man. Yeah, on fire today. And that's that whole concept of the finish line coming to you, is once you kind of get in the groove, it's not a matter of the answers anymore. It's just
Right.
executing.
You can do a behavior over and over and over until it doesn't take mental energy anymore. And there's practical benefits to that. But unless it speaks to you on a level of psychological health, do I feel good when I do this? Because there are plenty of people who do things that they're programmed to do and hate it. And I still think that kind of defeats the purpose, because we've discussed in earlier podcasts that really people are chasing a feeling and they don't know how to describe that feeling. So they assign a physical attribute to it, right? I will feel better when I have achieved X. And they don't really want to achieve X. They just want to feel better. So I feel like if we attack the feeling better part, then you can achieve X without having it be a means to an end.
Absolutely. That's one of the things that I think RD does best is really examines that. Is this an arbitrary number, which we'll probably do another podcast on? Or is this a feeling you're chasing, and are you communicating it appropriately?
If you're ready to get the body you desire without depriving yourself of the foods you enjoy, download your free diet playbook now at www.relentlesspodcast.com.
What are the basics? What are the few basic things somebody can do to help them identify what their maximum maintainability is, or how to balance when to progress, when to maintain, and how to set it up in a way that you're looking into the future, right? I'm progressing now, and I have to set myself up in a way that will allow me to maintain some sort of progress, right? So how does one go about identifying and achieving their quote unquote maximum maintainability?
That's kind of like that $1 million question, if I've ever heard one. And I think really, honestly, it gets a little old hearing me say this, but like with most questions, I think the answer is usually it depends. What is the goal or goals that you're trying to achieve and balance? What maintains you at one point in life may not sustain you later in life. So it's always a moving goalpost. But, I think when you break it down, you distill it to its core, a singular focus, you can often obtain that with a direct and a focused method. You have one thing you want to do, you have a one-tracked mind, you can hammer down and you can achieve it. But the more you add in, the more delicate that balance becomes. And the more need there is for periods of specific focused improvement in one area with a maintenance phase in another area, and then rotating those in and out. I think that's how you can actually increase your attainability, but ensure it's maintainable and sustainable at the same time, if that makes sense. I think the key is like seasons. If you look at athletes, there's an in-season, an off-season, a pre-season, a post-season. There's times to build, there's times to grow and cut back, harvest, reap and sow. I think the thing is once you find out what the discrete goals you are trying to achieve, is find out how they can work in conjunction and find out how you can maintain them while you're pursuing others. And that's really where that balance falls. It's the juggling act. And the more pins, the more balls, the more flaming chainsaws, whatever you're juggling in there, the more careful you have to be and the more deliberate you have to be with the way you organize your seasons.
It is so difficult to progress, and it is so relatively easy to maintain. So it makes a whole lot of sense to split this up into phases or periods of time. And I know in weightlifting, because we're all athletes, it would be considered block periodization. And I think it's something we probably take for granted because it's so baked into our lives. It's kind of like for people listening, leave a review, leave a comment, pop in the Facebook group and let us know if this concept isn't making sense, because I think any one of us could make a quick training, a quick video, because I think we've all spent so much of our life actually going through these phases growing up as athletes. So if you want to know what that looks like, we can just fire something up and get on here and build training for you guys.
Yeah, the language really does seem familiar, and the concepts are intuitive to us coming from that strength sports and the athletic backgrounds. Like you said, whether it's peaking for a meet or in season or off seasons, but just that general stress accumulation and fatigue rest cycle needed to keep improving. It's kind of something we have a background in. But honestly, I think we've all found success applying these concepts in so many other facets, whether it's our business to hobbies, to Trevor's drawing, to happiness as a whole. The kind of value of seasons of specificity, so to speak, is kind of universal. And, like I said, I think taking discrete phases of improvement in certain areas while seeking to maintain in others makes a lot more sense in both theory and in practical application, and is generally just a lot more effective than just trying to get good at all things at once.
Reading books on high performance, you see musicians, chess players, athletes, strength sports, high performing business people, and they all go through the same, it's kind of a cyclic nature, right? It's phases of low intensity, phases of high intensity. I've seen strength athletes use like blast and cruise because they like hardcore words like that. In powerlifting, obviously you have different cycles. And even in business recently, we said, hey, we're going to throttle down this aspect of our business because we need to divert all our resources to this other aspect, and understand that that's part of having a higher maintainability, right? So client success, enrollment, system development, there's seasons for all of them. What has been developed at RD, what you guys have developed, is next to none as far as maintainability. And it's not a typical, because bodybuilders do this to an extent too when they say they're bulking and cutting, right? But we have a little bit different approach at RD. So talk about that cycle and how do people find success and maintain it?
I think one of the big things here is physique-wise, I think there's a major disconnect in a couple of ways. One, a lot of people have these unrealistic expectations of what's possible, not just what's congruent with human physiology, but what's possible for them to achieve and maintain. What somebody can do who's 18 and, with nothing else going on in their life when you're 42 with 4 kids are going to be kind of two different things. But two, it's also in terms of people that are always looking to move the goalpost and reset the starting point. They draw that line in the sand from which they feel they cannot cross, or they become utter failures, and neither of which are very productive for the long term. One of the things I think we see a lot is people come, and hey, who doesn't want the holy grail? But I want to gain muscle and lose fat, and this is possible. Dr. Kashi can rant on fatty oxidation and positive nitrogen balance and all these great things and how they're not mutually exclusive. But this typically requires a very slow, methodical, measured, managed approach that most people will not gravitate towards on their own. But, we get somebody that comes to us, with even worse idea of the recomp, the 240-pound fat powerlifter, which I use because I think all of us on this show can relate to it, because I know I was one of those guys, but that thinks I can eventually just work my way up to a 240-pound shredded bodybuilder without having to lose size or feel small or buy new t-shirts. And it really doesn't work that way for the overwhelming majority of the planet. But instead, if you take the process and phases, you establish consistency first, you build a skill set, followed by periods of maybe targeted compositional change, then maintenance, then possibly a surplus stage, and you wash and rinse and repeat it over and over and over again, you probably won't end up being that 240-pound shredded bodybuilder, but you will see where you're actually at and can then subsequently make an informed decision on the improvement that you want to make. And to me, that seems to be the way to go. It's not necessarily your maximum attainability, but it is the maintainability and the sustainable approach to actually find out where you're at. And I think that's where that disconnect is people really do have those unrealistic expectations.
Yeah, I don't think it's their fault either. Most people have no idea what realistic expectations are. And that's part of like this frame shift terminology, right? Like you can ingrain behaviors, you can force people to count, you can do all sorts of things, but if they're like chasing a mirage, eventually a person will realize that, and all of the habits and rituals and motivation surrounding all the things that were put in place to keep a person progressing will fall apart. And I think that's important to mention, that like that disconnect is extremely important to address, and part of that cognition stuff that we were mentioning before. Like the reason why you are doing this is because you want to get to some place. And if that place is not realistic to get to, eventually that will catch up with you. And no matter what systems you have in place to keep yourself on track, you will derail.
like you said, it comes down to understanding, one, the feeling you're chasing may not be tied to that actual goal that you think it is. And two, understanding again that actual progress more often than not is going to come during cycles of loss, maintenance, and gain. We tend to focus on food and composition a lot because that's in our wheelhouse, but you can really apply this to anything. But going back to, again, what we do with RD, you can't just find your lowest body weight on your best day in your last hypocaloric phase and simply declare that that's your new starting point. Draw that line in the sand and refuse to ever cross it. That is not life. What goes up must come down, and vice versa. Let's be honest, we all have periods where we feel fluffy, but doing things the right way over time, the actual difference. And again, that's not how you feel, because that's two totally different issues altogether. Maybe something we need an entire podcast episode to jam on, of the difference between feelings and actual information. But the actual difference between your fluffiest stage and your leanest stage, that gap, right there, through structured and focused phases, that gap gets closer and closer together to the point where at your worst, people will still tell you how great you look. And honestly, that is not a bad place to be at all. You just got to be willing to go through the work and periodize your progress and go through those phases and those seasons. And that could mean putting your physical goals on hold and maintain while you work on your business goals, your life goals, your family goals, and then pick it back up once you're in a place to go into cruise mode on those things. But that, I think, is the key, is through periods and cycles and phases. On your worst, you still got people telling you how great you are. And that's not a bad spot.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of the concept of the ceiling and the floor, and everybody's so concerned about getting that ceiling as high as possible, but you got to realize bringing the floor up is nice too. When your floor is higher than everybody else's ceiling, you're living a pretty good life.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I think we kind of gone over a little bit on that one. We all had a little bit of word vomit there. But like Nick said, if you want to hear anything else, just let us know. Pop a comment in, contact us in the Facebook group, and we'll circle back on this and touch on it again. When at your fluffiest, you're at somebody else's after. It's not a bad spot to be. So while you can't always raise the roof, you can kind of raise the floor. Keep putting those two closer together through periods and phases, and you'll probably end up in a good spot.
You've been listening to the Relentless Podcast. Now, if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to keep getting a little bit better every day, do us a favor, head over to iTunes, subscribe, leave us an honest review, and be sure not to miss the next one.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.